Welcome to episode 234 of the Various Sunday podcast. I am your host, Matt Harmon, joined live in our virtual studio on the internet by my good friend, my colleague, my co-host, and the man who is joining us from his hotel room, John Scott Sloat.
Doc, what's going on? Yeah, I'm in Grand Rapids this week.
Yeah, you're doing the conference thing.
Yep, up at Acton for the remainder, most of this week anyway.
Yeah, excellent. Well, we are going to condense the intro here, so we have plenty of time for our guest, but we will let you know if you would like to get in touch with the show. You can find us on X, formerly known as Twitter, at VNS Pod. You can email the show, variousandsundarypodcast@gmail.com. You can find us on Facebook and on YouTube, and we, of course, invite you to leave a 5-star rating and a review wherever you access the podcast. So we are excited today to be joined live in our virtual studio by Patrick Schreiner. So we'll give his official biography here. Patrick Schreiner is the director of the residency PhD program, associate professor of New Testament and Biblical Theology at Midwestern Baptist Theological Seminary, and Jean and Joe Downing Endowed Chair of Biblical Studies. I don't know how that all fits on one business card. So
I just told someone it's way too long of a title. So,
well,
there it is.
I'm condensing what's on the Midwestern website here.
I guess Baptists are starting to like really long titles. I don't know.
That's true. There you go. Patrick is the author of numerous books, including, of course, the book we have chosen this year for our summer read, The Transfiguration of Christ, Beholding the Glorious Son. Patrick also serves as an elder at Emmaus Church in North Kansas City. He's married to Hannah, and they have 4 children. They love good local food, the outdoors, sports, and he enjoys serving local churches through teaching and preaching. Patrick, welcome to the program.
Thanks, Matt and John. Thanks for having me. Good to see you guys, even though it's virtual. I've been to the Acton conference in Grand Rapids, John, so I know what you're experiencing, at least somewhat.
It's a good time, man. It's awesome.
Yep, that's great.
Yeah. All right. So consistent with our show, Patrick, we're going to start with sports. And I know it's in your official biography on the Midwestern website. So
I'm a sports guy.
There you go. So let me start. You're a Timberwolves fan, right?
Yeah. So, I mean, my sports history is confusing because I've kind of picked up teams with all the different places I've lived, but I grew up in Minnesota. Actually grew up going to John Piper's church, and right down the road was the Metrodome. And we would go see, the Timberwolves. We would see the Vikings. We would see the Twins. So I grew up with those 3 teams, but then I moved to Oregon. Now I'm in Kansas City. So I've kind of picked up teams along the way, but historically it was like Kevin Garnett, Stephon Marbury, Wally Zerbiak. Those were kind of my guys I grew up with, cheering for the Timberwolves. And then they went through a long drought. And to be honest, I kind of lost them for a little while as I went to Portland, picked up Damian Lillard, kind of got into his team, and a little bit followed him to the Bucks. And so enjoyed going to watch him play. I just love basketball, grew up playing basketball. But then as the Timberwolves have started to kind of ascend again, I've started to pay more attention to them.
Yeah, and they had an excellent year. I mean, were you satisfied with their playoff run?
Yes. I mean, always you want them to do more and win the championship. But actually, my brother and I were able to go to Minnesota for one of the games against Denver. We last minute decided he flew in from the West Coast. I drove from Kansas City just on a whim. Honestly, we were both like the week of, hey, we should go see a game. The Timberwolves have not been here for a long time. And so we went and saw a game. Unfortunately, it was a blowout. That was the game that Denver killed them. And so that was interesting. But it was fun to see them live. They had such a good season. I think they came into the series versus Dallas tired. And I don't think the matchup worked very well versus Dallas. I think they did some things wrong. So I was hoping they'd give Dallas a little bit of a better fight. But our team is a team. If you watch them at all this season, their offense thrives off their defense, and they couldn't stop Luka or Kyrie in that series. And so they're offense couldn't get going because their defense couldn't hold those two guys. So that was unfortunate to watch them play versus Dallas that way. But to beat Denver, the reigning champs, man, they are a great team. I don't know if we could do it again, but we beat them in 7 games, and that was amazing to watch. There were many moments where I was either on my bed or on the couch and jumping up and down when they were scoring and winning versus Denver. So that was really fun for me and for us just to kind of see them go far. Minnesota, if you follow Minnesota sports, they never win anything. And so it's a terrible existence to have to follow Minnesota sports. And I have horror stories of watching the Vikings or the Timberwolves or the Twins, and it just feels like, man, they can't win. The Twins have won. They've won some World Series. They have, but Vikings have been to 4 Super Bowls. There's a whole YouTube show about it, but Vikings have been to 4 Super Bowls and they've lost every single one. And I think the first one they went to, like a guy like airdropped into the stadium and he like crash landed, and they were like, then they fumbled the punt return. It was like from the moment the game started, this is not going well.
Go ahead, John.
Well, I was just going to ask, how is it being in Kansas City now with obviously there's been a lot of success in Kansas City sports in the last, certainly in the football end in the last several years, and even baseball in the not too distant past as well.
That's right. Yeah, it's been really fun. So I'm still a Vikings fan, but I've definitely picked up the Chiefs. Haven't been to a game yet. Actually been trying to. It's so expensive because they're so good to go to a game. Haven't gone to a game yet. And so maybe this year is my year to go. I'd like to go during the Mahomes, Kelsey era. But, we're in mid-America, flyover land. There's not a lot to do. So people watch football and cheer for the Chiefs. So everyone loves the Chiefs here. The whole town gets into it on the days that they play, whatever day that is. So it's just fun to be in the city with them. And I cheer for the Chiefs when they're playing. And then when the Chiefs play the Vikings, I've got to go and pray and figure out what I'm going to do. So they don't play that often, and they would only really meet in a Super Bowl. And so because they're in different divisions. So if that time ever comes, I'll decide what to do then.
Yeah. Those are the good kind of problems to have, right?
That's right.
So, what was your take on all the Taylor Swift buzz that accompanied the Chiefs this year? Is that something that, from what I remember, I'm not going to call you a Swiftie, but you appreciate at least some of Taylor Swift's music.
Yeah, I don't have bracelets. I think they do bracelets when they go to concerts, but yeah, I thought it was just kind of fun at the beginning. I actually thought it was really fun because a lot of females who weren't interested in football in Kansas City became interested in football because of Taylor Swift. And so I think it brought a whole new crowd. But then it also, like everything does, the snake started to eat itself. It gave another reason for Chief haters to start hating the Chiefs all the more, because there's Taylor Swift. They're showing her all the time. You've got Travis Kelce. She's been dating these guys from England, and now she's finally dating the American football player, right? So everyone's very happy until they aren't. And so the Chiefs, anytime a team starts winning a lot, it's easy to begin hating them. I think at the beginning of their, what I would call a dynasty now, people like to watch them because they were the new, young, fast team with Tyreek Hill, with Patrick Mahomes, who could do so much. Now it's very easy to hate them. And so the Taylor Swift thing was fun, and then it kind of turned into another reason for people not to like them. Honestly, I'm just kind of like, it is what it is. It's 2 celebrities dating. I don't take a lot of stock in it. So
right.
Here we go. I just I don't think it was a distraction for them, and I hope it continues not to be. And so I think this year, the Chiefs look pretty good. They have better wide receivers. Last year, they really struggled at the wide receiver position. And so I think the big question for us is, can the offensive line hold up for Patrick Mahomes? So we'll see what happens.
Well, I've got
one make of JJ McCarthy going to your Vikings.
Yeah, I mean, I don't watch a ton of college football because I have 4 kids and I have a job and I have a church. And so I try to stick to like pro football, not college football. So honestly, I didn't watch a lot of like JJ McCarthy play. From what I know, he had a great defense. He was a good player with Michigan. And so honestly, I feel like quarterbacks are a toss-up and going from college to the NFL. So who am I to step in here and give you my opinion about how he's going to do? I'm for college quarterbacks who enter the NFL, let's wait and see. I think
Yeah.
you want to look for those intangibles like the leadership, the drive, the aggressiveness, the I'm gonna beat everyone, which I think Patrick Mahomes kind of has that. Like he has that kind of Michael Jordan type killer mentality. I really think that's what you want to look for, probably more than mechanics. And so
Mm.
I honestly I don't know that about JJ McCarthy. I was sad to see Kirk Cousins leave just because I love Kirk Cousins as a Christian believer, as a good
Mhm.
guy. He's just such a great guy who loves the Lord. I don't think they were I don't know if they were going to win with Kirk a Super Bowl, but I really like Kirk Cousins as a person. So it was sad to see him leave the Vikings, but I also understand it's a business. You've got to make changes. And I think his wife's family is from Atlanta. So good for him to move closer to family. That's great for him. So we'll see. JJ McCarthy, we'll see what happens. I wasn't like overly excited. I wasn't overly disappointed. I was kind of like, well, okay, here we go. New quarterback. So that's my very educated take on JJ McCarthy, who I watched like 0 games of.
There you go. Well, I'll avoid derailing the whole show on my thoughts on JJ McCarthy. See, I'm an Ohio State fan, and so
Okay.
I'm admittedly a little bit biased,
Yeah.
but I don't think I'll put it this way. I'd be surprised if he's a very successful NFL quarterback
Yeah.
because I do think at Michigan he did not have to win them games.
Yeah.
He relied on
That's
his
my
defense,
understanding too. Yeah. And
his
that makes
running
total
game.
sense. Yeah.
I think he is a competitor. I think he has some of that kind of alpha dog in him in terms of that mentality, but I'm just not sure that he can, throw the ball in tight windows, read coverage as well, all that kind of stuff. That's kind of the bare minimum for a, professional quarterback to be able to succeed. But
Yeah. Yep.
that could also be
I think that's wise.
that could be my dislike of that team up north as well. So I'll just acknowledge my
I
bias up
understand.
front. So.
I understand.
All right. Well, Patrick, let's transition to discussing your book, The Transfiguration of Christ. As I had told you, we've been reading through this on the podcast, meaning we'll take a couple chapters each week, spend a little time talking about that segment, inviting our readers to jump in and join with us. And so we're excited to have you on board to talk with us about the book. Let me just start with asking what led you to write on the Transfiguration?
Yeah, so I've kind of almost accidentally stumbled into writing on neglected aspects of Christ's life. It was started basically with a small book I did on the Ascension that just seemed to resonate with a lot of people, just to put our focus back on an important event in Christ's life that maybe we don't speak a lot about. And because that seemed to resonate with people, I began to think, oh, is there other events that I could do this with? And honestly, it was one day I was teaching through Matthew and I came to the Transfiguration. I thought, I haven't thought a lot about this. And I kind of looked for resources on it. I couldn't find many, even on the bookshelves at our library, there wasn't many. And I noticed that Protestants weren't really writing on this event, while you have more in the Eastern Orthodox tradition and more from the church fathers as well. And so it became, not only did I love teaching on it, I felt like it was a event and a narrative that had so much depth to it that in my 2-hour session that I was covering, or whatever session I felt like I was only scratching the surface. So usually for me, these books are honestly just, I wanted to study it more. I thought it could be beneficial and useful to the church. It kind of aligned with this idea that I had that maybe I'll do some more neglected aspects of Christ's life. I have maybe a third book idea for a topic in the same realm. And so really it was the lack of resources I saw. I thought it was an event that you really kind of compress into exegesis, biblical theology, systematic theology, spiritual formation. I've got the problem of being interested in way too many things. And so it kind of brings all of my interests together. And so I was excited just to write on it. And then honestly, it was just one of those times where like an outline came into my head. I wrote it down. I was like, I would love to do a book on this. And so I pitched it to Baker and they seem excited about it as well. And so, yeah, as you look around, you just don't see a lot from Protestants on it. I was talking to Carl Truman, on their podcast the other week, and he was kind of lamenting that we don't have more resources from Protestants on it, and so I'm hoping to kind of fill that gap.
So you go in depth in the book about why this is neglected, but if you're going to give like an elevator pitch to somebody, just sort of like a 2-minute explainer on why has this been neglected by Protestants, what are you going to tell people?
Yeah, I'm going to tell people it's probably been neglected. Maybe the first reason I'd say is because it's mysterious and symbolic. You read the narrative and you don't know, why is Jesus's face shining? Why is there light in the scene? Why are his clothes bright? Why do Moses and Elijah appear? There's all these kind of symbols there that it's hard to know how to interpret them unless you're following the whole flow of the Bible. And then I'd also say for Protestants, we probably think more about, and I put this in the book, more about the means by which we are saved than the goal to which we are saved. And so the means by which we are saved is through the cross. The goal is what the church tradition is called the beatific vision, to be with God, to see him face to face. So the transfiguration might be neglected because it is speaking, I think it's actually speaking to both, but ultimately it is kind of showing us this final vision that we are going to get of Christ. And then the other reason, yeah, I'm giving 3 now. You said 2 minutes, but I'm past my 2 minutes. It does sit out of order in terms of the narrative, in terms of like you see Jesus glorified, and then he goes back to being kind of this normal human Jesus, and then he goes to the cross. So it's when you're telling a linear or chronological view of Christ's life, it sits a little out of place, and we just don't know, like, why did he do this here at this point? Why do we get like a foreshadowing of what is to come at this point? And so it's easy to skip over because it doesn't fit into kind of that linear narrative Christology that we like to tell, that Christ was born, he did his ministry, he died, he rose again. Wait, where does the transfiguration fit? It's like a preview of what is to come. And so we probably skip over it for that reason as well.
So one of the distinctive features of your approach to dealing with the transfiguration, and I think this is true if people are aware of some of your other writings, they'll see this, but I feel like in this book, it came out into more clearer focus, more in full flower, is your blend of biblical theology, historical theology, and systematic theology. Typically, at least in the academy, and I know you're writing sort of in between the academy and the church in this book. Typically, scholars tend to focus on one of those dynamics, maybe 2, but rarely do you see someone try to actively, intentionally, and consistently integrate all 3 of those approaches. So why did you approach the book that way?
Yeah, because number one, it's my interests. I love thinking about systematic theology. It's not what I was trained in. I love reading through the church fathers, through the reformers. I love reading people who came before us, and I like thinking about spiritual formation as well in terms of how this should form us as whole people, as Christians who are seeking to follow Jesus. So the first thing I'd say is just that it's what I desire to do. And then I also, as I look through the Christian tradition, this is how I see the early church really interpreting. They didn't have those separate silos that we do. And I think the silos can be helpful. I don't want to just critique them in terms of, okay, I do biblical theology, I do biblical studies, I do systematic theology. Sometimes those silos can help us because we can become better experts in those fields. And I recognize that. But what I see from especially the early church and from the reformers is they're interacting with all of these concepts at the same time. In other words, when they're opening the scriptures, they're recognizing systematic theology is not necessarily even a separate step, but rather it's integrated into their exegesis, which ultimately for interpreters arises though from the text. So you start with the text, and from that you draw kind of the whole biblical storyline, and from that you draw kind of categories of Trinitarian doctrine or Christological doctrine. And so it's really the way that I find myself preaching, teaching, and I want to write that way too. The danger is obviously that I don't know enough about it to speak well about it, but I hope I did enough homework here to show that at least I can interact with it. And certainly there's topics in here that I thought, oh, this is a whole book in itself. I just can't get into it. But I think readers can know that, like, you can go to other sources to see this more. And then maybe the final thing I'd say though is I became more increasingly convinced that because I was trained in biblical studies, that you cannot understand the transfiguration without some of these doctrinal parameters in place or these doctrinal guidelines to help you do exegesis in place. In other words, as I looked through modern commentaries, just you pick up any, it's told in the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. If you pick up most modern commentaries, I felt that their exegesis was actually deficient because they were not using systematic theology categories. In other words, they were thinking so much about Greco-Roman backgrounds or Jewish backgrounds, which I do some of that too, and I think it's helpful, but they neglected to use some categories from the Christian tradition, which would help them speak of Christ's two natures in one subject, or how God is light himself and what sort of light this is, or how the triune God is revealed to us in the Spirit through the Son from the Father, or these categories that can actually, I would argue, really enlighten our exegesis rather than crush the text and make it say something that it doesn't originally say. I think it lets us see things that are already in the text. So ultimately, these categories, I think, end up being a help to us, a tool by which we ask the text different questions than we might originally ask. And so one of the lines in my book, I don't exactly remember how I said it, but that ultimately it's difficult to interpret this text in all of its glory and all of its light without those categories assisting us. And so that's why my main argument in the book, although there's many sub-arguments in the book, is that modern interpreters, when they come to this, only see Jesus's future glory, but that this is also his pre-existent and eternal glory that is being revealed. And both can be true at the same time because he is God and man. And so if you just have this kind of pre-existent Christology, which I think confessional Christians do, but as you get probably into the higher critical school, there's a lot of debate about the synoptic gospels of whether that theme is actually there, or is it just in John? And I think here, if I'm just talking to scholars, I think here modern scholars need to do more careful work on the Transfiguration. I think this is a key text that the early church used for Jesus's pre-existent glory. It was a key text that the church fathers used in terms of their Christology and how he is one with the Father. So yeah, that's kind of gives you a big picture of why I think it's so important for this text and for us to interact not only with the storyline, which I do, not only with just exegesis, which I do, but also systematic theology and church history and the Chalcedonian Creed, the Nicene Creed. I think were hugely helpful for me in saying, what categories do I have already that people have thought through that can help me think through this event?
Patrick, one thing that as I read your book, and I think as people read your book, they can't help but notice how many quotes of church fathers you have throughout the book. Mm-hmm. I imagine that was really, really intentional on your part. Could you maybe let us know about why you went after so many church fathers, why you quoted so many of them for this particular book, and then on top of that, like, if we have listeners that are interested in reading the church fathers, reading those primary sources, where do you point them? Where should they go?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, part of the reason I quoted from them so much is I thought their exegesis was just really good of this text. And I thought they often phrase things in a way you can tell that these are homilies often from them. So they're sermons. And what I loved is that they are integrating, it's kind of going back to Matt's question, they're integrating biblical theology with systematic theology in this seamless way that has this pastoral punch at the same time. And so in one way, I just couldn't help but quote them because I was like, oh, this is so good. So my first foray, after kind of doing exegesis of the text myself for classroom settings, my first foray into the Transfiguration was a book called Light on the Mountain, edited by Brian Daly, which is in the popular patristic series. He just collects patristic and Byzantine kind of homilies throughout the centuries on the Transfiguration. And it's a 250 page book. I mean, it's a smaller book, but it's 250 pages. And honestly, that's the best book on the Transfiguration. Whenever people write me and they're like, "Hey, what should I read? I'm about to preach on the Transfiguration." I, I don't tell them any. I just tell them pick up that book. Honestly, if you just read that book, you are good to go. Because I think they do the work that's necessary. It somewhat becomes repetitive after time because they're using each other, right? And so they might start to make some of the same comments. So as you get kind of halfway through it, you kind of got the point. But I found their work just hugely helpful in terms of what I was trying to do. They were also, as I just alluded to, they were thinking about Christology. They were thinking about Christ's eternal glory. And so again and again, I was thinking, can this be proved from the text? And I wanted to do the textual work and not just say, well, the church father said it. But I do think it's a help to say, well, other people have seen this too. Other people that were reading this text and they saw these things as well. And so I think often it's helpful to have, here's an exegetical argument from the text itself. Here's a biblical theological argument from the whole canon of scripture. And then here's a church history argument. And so, I don't, sometimes the church fathers do things and I'm like, I don't agree with that. I find it strange. And I think that's often how people think of the church fathers when they read through them. But if you pick up a book like this Light on the Mountain, I think, especially if you're in church ministry or you've thought through biblical theology, your heart will really soar. It'll be a great help to you. So in terms of that second question, where should they go? I would look at the popular patristic series. They're short little books that they're kind of collecting. I think those are hugely helpful. And then you can look at Schaff's edited work, the Ante-Nicene Fathers and the Post-Nicene Fathers. That's a larger series, but he's translated so much of the early church for us. That's a great resource just to have on your shelves. Then you also have IVP is doing series on like Reformation commentary of Scripture and then ancient Christian commentary of Scripture. So often when I'm preaching, like everybody else, I don't have time to go and look through all the church fathers and see what they said on this. That IVP series is hugely helpful because it's textual based. In other words, like on Matthew 15, they'll say, oh, this is what Chrysostom said. This is what Augustine said. This is what Origen said. And they'll just kind of give snippets. So every once in a while, I'll just kind of look through those to give myself a sense of what they're saying about these texts. So there's some like three things you could look at for the fathers. More and more is being translated. And so I'm just honestly continually just going back to the primary resources as much as I can, reading them, gaining insights from them. But then also I wanted to interact with modern interpreters. I began with interacting with modern interpreters as well.
So one of the things you mentioned is wanting to help people see the practical implications. And I'm going to kind of wed two things here together because I think they're related. You're interested in the practical implications of the Transfiguration for the Christian life, but also, and I think this is a feature that I think will strike a lot of evangelical readers I think it'll maybe catch them off guard, or at least they'll go, huh, is as I'll put it, you almost, I'll say you flirt with language that could be understood as theosis or deification, which is a common staple in the Orthodox tradition, but something that in the Western tradition has been not as commonly discussed. So respond a little bit to that in terms of maybe you could give just a brief 30-second definition when we say theosis or that sort of thing, what the Eastern Church is typically talking about, and then how your approach or understanding of the Transfiguration has some similarities to it, but also some distinctions from it.
Yeah, that's good. In terms of practical theology or spiritual formation, the other thing I noticed, if we're just going to keep this line, the other thing I noticed as I read through Light on the Mountain and all the patristic homilies on the Transfiguration is they not only did systematic theology, biblical theology, exegesis, but they were constantly pointing their readers to the reality of you are meant to be formed by this text. And even more than that, they would take even little details, like they would go up the mountain and say to their hearers, we need to go up the mountain and see Jesus as well. We need to ascend up the mountain. We need to behold his light. We need to be transformed and transfigured by his light. So they very quickly would go to what they would call the tropological sense, the moral sense of the scripture. And they would see in these images a call for action, a call for response, a call to do something. And again, I found that's if I'm preaching at church, that's what I'm going to be speaking about as I do my exegesis as well. And so I found that very helpful. And I just kind of use those ideas to say, yes, this text isn't just speaking of a historical event of which Jesus went up a high mountain, which occurred. But rather, if you look through the whole of the scriptures, you're seeing that there's a call for God's people to also ascend God's mountain, to go into his presence. And so, again, they're not just like pulling these words out of context, they're thinking canonically and biblically, theologically, that in the Psalms, David is asking, who shall ascend the hill of the Lord? And so I think they're connecting those sort of texts with this text, and I think we are meant to as well. So ultimately, if you look at the kind of structure of where the transfiguration sits within the narrative of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, ultimately the transfiguration is meant to be light in the midst of darkness, hope in the midst of despair, because Jesus has just told them that he's going to go to the cross and die. And the disciples, I think, are fearful. They don't know what to do with that. And we know that's true because of Peter's response to Jesus. And so it occurs at the same place in terms of the narrative flow in all of the synoptic gospels. So ultimately, the transfiguration is meant to be hope for the disciples to say, glory is to come on the other side of suffering. And in terms of practical theology, I think what Paul does with this is he says, hey, if glory was to come for Jesus, it's also to come for those who are in Christ, so that your suffering is not worth to be compared to the eternal glory, the weight of glory that is going to be given to you. And so Paul very quickly, I think in 2 Corinthians 3 and Romans 12, 1 through 2, etc., he's connecting the event of the transfiguration, or the event of God's glory resting on God's people, with the reality that we live in a dark and trial-filled world, but that's not the end of the story. And so in terms of practical theology, I think we just have to go there with this narrative. This isn't just about Jesus. This is about those who are in Christ as well. And that brings us to your second question, flirting with the idea of theosis. That just means there's various definitions that are given, but that we become like God. Theosis, we are glorified. Now, when I first came across that concept, I've obviously heard of the concept before I dealt with this book, but I started to read the Greek tradition, and I started to think, okay, I've got to think about this more because I'm writing a book on the Transfiguration. This is the text that they use a lot for this idea of theosis, which is it's not a biblical term. It doesn't occur in the scriptures. But as I began to think about it, there are some mistakes I think that the Eastern Orthodox tradition makes with theosis that I would distinguish myself from. So for example, I think we need to protect ourselves from blurring the line between the creator and the creature. That line never goes away, even if you're going to affirm a form of theosis. Also, in Eastern Orthodox tradition, it occurs through the sacraments. Also, in the Eastern Orthodox tradition, there's a lack of emphasis probably on justification and the moment that you are declared righteous. And so maybe they view salvation more as a process than also an event. And I think you can actually have both at the same time. It seems like the scriptures are affirming both. And so I would certainly want to give some cautions. However, as I looked, and again, I don't claim to be an expert on this. I'm more of an expert on this probably than J.J. McCarthy. Let's just put it that way. But less than Kirk Cousins is on the level of football. Let's put it that way, right? So I would love to do more work on this. But here's the interesting reality. All of the church fathers that I've read affirmed some form of it. All of the reformers affirmed some form of it. Most Baptists, like Keach, Gill, Spurgeon, affirmed some form of it. And then you start to go to some texts and you start to think, okay, what does Peter mean when he says we become partakers of the divine nature? What does Jesus mean when he quotes from the Psalms and says that we are gods? What does John mean in 1 John 3:2 when he says, when he appears, we shall see him as he is, and we shall be like him? What does it mean that we're like him? What does it mean when Jesus prays that we would be one as he is one with the Father? What does it mean in Ephesians that Paul prays that we would be filled with the fullness of God? And then I started to think, honestly, it feels like theosis. And maybe I need to do more work on this. Admittedly, if someone's an expert, I'm happy to talk to them more about this. isn't theosis just another way to talk about glorification in the Protestant tradition? It feels like that to me. And then you start to like, okay, so what do we partake of in terms of the divine nature? Well, I think 1 Corinthians 15 is really helpful here because Paul talks about what is sown perishable will be raised imperishable. That's taking on something of God. God is imperishable, and then we become imperishable. What is sown is in dishonor is raised in glory. Oh, who has ultimate glory? Where does glory come from? Oh, it's God. What is sown in weakness is raised in power. Who has ultimate power? So we're sharing in God's imperishability, in his glory, in his power. We bear, 1 Corinthians 15:49 says, we bear the image of the man of heaven. We're raised imperishable. We put on immortality. Luke speaks about, and Jesus and Luke speaks about, we become like the angels. So let's press down more into it. And I don't really care what language we use, but the biblical concepts of sharing, participating in the life of God, becoming like him in some sense, I would say is there in the scriptures, and I would say is there in the Christian tradition. And so while the word theosis and deification, we're like, we don't use that word, we don't use that term. I think the concept, if you can kind of press down into the concept, it's there. You just have to have some parameters. You have to understand what we mean by it. And we do have to define it well, as you kind of got to. So I'm open to the idea. I just want to make sure we know what we're speaking of and what we're not speaking of. And so I try to give some of those categories, but I also want some people who have maybe grown up hearing the term sanctification or glorification, it just rolls off your tongue and into your mind and out your mind. It means nothing, basically. So sometimes actually changing the term theosis, saying something like that, people are like, what do you mean by that? And then the doctrine actually starts to shine a little more brightly because we go to texts like 1 Corinthians 15. And for me, it became, or these texts like 2 Peter 1 or 1 John 3:2. And I start thinking, yeah, we are transfigured like Jesus is transfigured, aren't we? That's precisely what Paul says in 2 Corinthians 3, that we will go from glory to glory, right, as we behold him. And our images will change into an image like his. But ultimately, that only comes by participating in him, right? He is the one. It's still a gift to us, right? It's not inherent to us. It's inherent in God himself, but it's a gift to us. So having all those categories, I think, in place, Karl Moser, some people question whether the reformers spoke in this way. Karl Moser has like 3 or 4, maybe 2 to 4 great journal articles where he just goes through the reformers, and you can just read them. And he's like, yeah, they are all speaking in this language as well. And so it's not just the church fathers. It kind of tracks through history. I think we are probably the abnormal ones who feel a little bit hesitant as far as I can tell in terms of church history. So I actually thought about doing a larger project on it. I don't know if I'll ever get to it. I certainly need to do more work on it, but stumbling across it was actually helpful for me and helped me think, and I think rejoice in the glorification that will be ours one day even more, because I kind of was able to put, so to speak, more flesh on it.
Very good.
That
Very
response,
good.
all you get is a very good.
Yeah,
Doc,
I mean,
any
Patrick and I could
questions?
talk about more about that at some point, but not that I disagree with you, but I would like to have a follow-up conversation with you at some point about that. It would be good for us to.
Yeah,
I'd
that'd be great.
enjoy that conversation. Go ahead,
I'll
John.
sit there and drink coffee while you guys talk. It'll be great. Doc, I'm ready to move on. Do you want to ask? Do we want to ask what he's working on, or do you have
I
another
was going to
question?
give you one more question before we kind of moved on here. So if you want to, John, take one more question.
Yeah, I think, Patrick, just to give our listeners a sense, where can they find your work more broadly, and what are you working on now? Like what's in the pipeline currently?
Yeah, I don't really know ever what to say. Where can they find my work? I guess Amazon. Nobody has local bookstores anymore, right? Nobody's selling Christian books. So go to the big conglomerate Amazon, the beast who's taking over, and buy from them. I'm sure, you could go to TGC's bookstore, Westminster as well. You can find some of my works there. But if you just go to Amazon and type in my name, you can find I've done some work on Acts, especially focus on, in terms of my scholarly career so far, the narrative portions of the New Testament has kind of been the way I've described what do I focus on. And so whether that's Matthew or Acts, and I think my next project will probably be something on John, I'm kind of focusing on the narrative portions right now of the New Testament. But the problem is, as I said earlier, I have varied interests, and so I'm probably going to step into many things over hopefully my career. And but yeah, just go to Amazon. I try to stay somewhat active on Twitter, but right now, my wife changed the password and I don't know how to get back on. And I did that on purpose because I want to get off for the rest of the summer. So don't find me on Twitter for the next few months. I don't know when I'm going to get back on, but it was just honestly depressing to me. So I got off for a little bit.
That's probably the better part of wisdom right there, to be honest.
That's right.
So,
That's right.
I did, before we move on, the most recent book that's come out, you had a book come out on the Gospels. Why don't you briefly tell us about that?
Oh yeah, and I forgot to tell you what I was working on. I forgot about the second question. Yeah, so I just had a book come out in the Gospels. It's a textbook with Mark Strauss and Gary Schnitter. I always forget how to say his last name. Schnittger, right?
Schnicker. There you go. Schnicker.
Yeah, there. So he's editing the Old Testament, and then Mark Strauss is editing the New Testament, and it's meant to be a shorter textbook series so you can supplement with other books. I think as a professor, I'm continually looking for shorter textbooks so that I can supplement it with maybe other special studies. I find students find that helpful rather than a very large textbook. So I think in the past, textbooks have been longer. It's kind of been like the only book you assign. Now I think people are looking for shorter textbooks so they can assign other things. So this one, it's maybe less than 200 pages. It's on the four Gospels. And probably the distinctive of it focuses on biblical theology, connections to the Old Testament, and connections to the gospel. And as we've been speaking about, even spiritual formation or how this affects you. And so at the end of each chapter, not only do we walk through the gospel or whatever text we're going through, but we say, how does this connect if you're in the Old Testament to the New Testament and from the New Testament to the Old Testament? And then what does this show us about the gospel itself, the good news? Which was an interesting thing to do for the Gospels, right? Because I think when they thought of that idea, they were like, this will really help for the Old Testament, right? So I'm like, okay, how do the Gospels connect to the gospel? Well, it's kind of like in the narrative itself, right? So what I did, though, is I thought there's unique aspects of the gospel that are highlighted in each of the Gospels, whether that's thematically, in Mark, whether it's new Exodus, in Matthew, whether it's fulfillment, kind of promise and fulfillment. So I just kind of focus on those things to show them, hey, each gospel is giving us maybe a slightly different angle on the gospel, which coheres, obviously, ultimately. The next book I'm working on is a book on hermeneutics. So I've been talking a lot about the church fathers. Talked to Matt. I think I saw you at Tyndale House. I just started to work in Cambridge on it. But I'm working on a book on the fourfold sense that the kind of historical church has used as a way of interpreting the scriptures. Is called the Quadriga. And so I'm modernizing it in some form because I think there's some things that they do well and some things that we would probably disagree with. But I also think it's a helpful tool that we could use to look at the scriptures. And so I'm good. In terms of, I'm almost done with the first draft of it. I just keep editing, trying to hone it more. So I'm excited about that book. I think, again, it's kind of like the topic of theosis. It's kind of like, ooh, I'm not sure if we would use that. But as I begin to define things, I hope people will say, like, yeah, we already are doing something, some form of this. It's how do you define these different terms and how actually do you do it and what are the controls for it? And so I hope to get into that as well. So excited about that book.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, there's obviously a lot more we could talk about on the Transfiguration, your writing projects, but it is now time for This Day in Sports History.
All right, This Day in Sports History, June 25th. The year is just flying by. Hard to believe it's the end of June already. 1928, New York Giants future Baseball Hall of Famer third baseman Freddie Lindstrom ties a record of 9 hits in a doubleheader. in 12-4 and 8-2 wins over the Phillies. Love seeing the Phillies lose. At the Baker Bowl. Love seeing the Phillies lose. That's great. Freddie Lindstrom,
Never heard of him.
1969. I've never heard of him either. Apparently a Hall of Famer, though. 1969, American Pancho Gonzalez beats Puerto Rican Charlie Passarell 25 in 5 hours in 12 minutes, 112 game marathon at Wimbledon.
Yeah, they don't use a tiebreaker at Wimbledon in the last set, and so you just play until somebody gets a 2-game advantage, basically.
Oh goodness. Yeah, that's a long you always throw a cricket one in here, Matt, and I never know the sentence that I'm forming
That's
when I
part of the
read these
fun.
off. Yeah, that's part of the
Maybe
shtick.
maybe Patrick can use his quadriga to interpret it for us.
It's only for the scriptures, Matt. It's only for the scriptures.
1983 Cricket World Cup, Lords London, India upsets West Indies by 43 runs to win the first title. Mohinder Armanath, 3.5 over 7 overs, 3.5 off 7 overs, player of the match.
Clear as mud.
Yeah, sometimes you're just throwing words on a page.
It feels like it. Yeah. So last summer,
Welcome to
Patrick,
writing a book. No.
Yeah. we had Brian Rosner on the program because we read his How to Find Yourself book last year.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
And since he actually knows cricket, he tried to give some basic explanation to us, and we're still struggling with some of the basic elements of cricket for sure.
He did invite us to London to like watch cricket with him. Like
Is
he
he
was
gonna
going to
pay
come from
for it?
Australia. We were going to
Yeah.
meet him in London to watch cricket.
Yeah. If he
Yeah, he
pays for
didn't-
it, I'm there.
Yeah, he didn't offer that piece of it,
Okay.
but I may be going to the Tyndale Theology Conference next summer. So if Brian goes next summer, I'm going to hit him
There
up
you
for
go.
that. So
There you go.
And I will find a way to get there. Let's see. I've totally lost my spot now. 1997 NBA draft. Wake Forest power forward Tim Duncan, first pick by San Antonio Spurs. I remember that.
the big fundamental.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He was in there with the Admiral for a while.
Yeah, you're not
1999.
gonna like the next one, John. I'm just warning you.
So, Patrick, I am from the Long Island area, and so I'm a Knicks, Mets, and Jets fan. So that will explain anything here. NBA Finals, here we go. San Antonio Spurs beat the New York Knickerbockers 78-77. That sounds like a third quarter score right now. In
Yeah.
Game 5, for the first title in franchise history, MVP Tim Duncan.
Yeah. So that was back in the era where basketball was sort of a smaller form of mixed martial arts as well. So the whole freedom of movement and prioritizing the offensive game had not quite hit yet.
Yeah. 2015 NBA draft, Kentucky center Karl Anthony Towns, first pick by the Minnesota Timberwolves.
Yeah, the big cat.
Big cat. Still there.
That's this day in sports history.
All right. So, Patrick, do you have a favorite out of that? I'm guessing you might.
Yeah, I mean, favorite. The first one that stuck out to me was choosing Tim Duncan. Because the Wimbledon one sounded amazing and the cricket one sounded cool, but I don't know much about those. So there we are. Yeah, the Tim Duncan one, I mean, they won 4 or 5 championships, I think, with Duncan, and David Robinson was on the team when they chose him. And they became a powerhouse with Duncan, Ginobili. So that really changed the face of basketball for a while. During those years, what was it? I was just looking up, like 1999, 2003, 2005, 2007, 2014. Duncan was probably one of the most boring players to watch, but one of the most skilled. He was, like you said, Mr. Fundamental, never smiled about anything, just did his job and did it well. And so, yeah, I would go for the Tim Duncan one. Although the Cat one, is hard for me to pass up, right? Because he stuck it out through the hard years of Minnesota, and now that he has Ant by him, maybe they can do something.
Yeah. John, what do you think?
Oh, Tim Duncan it is. Let's go.
I agree. Yeah, I think both sort of historically and even just accomplishment wise. I mean, yeah, he and the fact that they won their first title in '99, and then their last one they won in, was it 2014, something like that?
Yeah, it's
so that's an incredible span.
Yeah,
where he was a significant contributor to that. So Tim Duncan, it is. One thing you liked. Patrick, let's start with you as the guest.
Yeah, one thing I liked, it's summer, really enjoying my Blackstone grill. If you know what a Blackstone grill is.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
You can go out there and cook burgers, or we a lot of time put sausage and potatoes, or we put shrimp on there the other day. And it's just, you kind of throw it on there, let it all cook together. Love the Blackstone grill. So we use it all the time, especially in the summer. Makes cooking very easy for someone who doesn't know how to cook, and it actually makes your kids believe you know how to. So love the Blackstone grill.
There you go. What about you, John?
I'm just going to throw out Acton University this week. Being up here is a lot of fun. It's one of the most unique conferences I think that's out there, where I can hear several different languages spoken, sit by Catholic priest and Orthodox priest and evangelical pastors, and get along to some extent. And I did see one of Patrick's books in the bookstore while I was here. Political Gospel was
nice.
We're here.
Not my book on theosis, because it's not out yet.
It's not out, no.
Excellent. So I'm going to go with last week I was also at a conference. A little bit of a strange experience for me. I was at the Gospel Coalition Women's Conference. So a little bit of explanation as to why I was attending there. This will not come as a surprise to John, since he knows this, but I do have another podcast. Yes, Ben Glad and I were at the conference together doing some interviews with, we interviewed Jen Wilkin and also Mary Hannah. And that is for our podcast, the Biblical Theology Briefing, which we are going to relaunch coming up in January underneath the Gospel Coalition umbrella of podcasts. And so we're recording some episodes for that in advance of that. And so also this gives me an opportunity to give Patrick a heads up that I'm sure he'll be receiving an invite at some point onto that podcast to talk with Ben and I about one of his many projects. So
that sounds great. Love to do that.
That is my one thing I liked. So Patrick, thanks for joining us on the program. We really appreciate it. And I know our listeners always enjoy hearing directly from the author of the books we choose for the summer read. So appreciate your ministry and your ongoing writing. And so thanks for taking some time to talk with us.
Thanks for reading it and engaging with it. Appreciate you guys.
Yeah. All right, John, we have talked about various sports allegiances that Patrick Schreiner has. We have talked about his book, The Transfiguration of Christ, an exegetical and theological reading. We have talked about Tim Duncan. We have talked about Patrick's Blackstone Grill. We have talked about the Acton University Conference. We've talked about the Gospel Coalition Women's Conference. And so I think by definition, we have covered our various and sundry topics. And all that's left to say is, until next time, the Lord bless y'all real good.
Later.